The child swept the floor of the vault of the last names, while the second sun went out forever. It did not go out the way a sun should. It did not redden and swell and cool over slow ages. It simply dimmed, all at once, as if a great mouth had closed over it. One breath, the sky above the temple world of Oresh held 2 suns. The next breath it held one, and a cold that had no business arriving so fast. Her name was Sephi, and she was 11 turns old, and she had been sweeping the same 9 stone aisles every morning since she was small enough to ride the broom. She did not look up at the dimming. She had been taught not to look up. The keepers of Oresh kept their eyes on the floor, on the dust, on the carved names, because the floor was the only thing left that still belonged to her people. The sky belonged to the devouring now. The devouring was coming. Everyone on Oresh knew it, the way they knew their own heartbeat. It had eaten the outer suns of their cluster one by one, year after year, and each time a sun went dark, a world went silent, and each silent world meant the great hunger was one step closer to the temple, at the center of everything. Sephi's grandmother had said the devouring would reach Oresh before Sephi was grown. Her grandmother had been wrong about the timing. It was reaching Oresh now, while Sephi was still a child, while she still held a broom. She set the broom against a pillar and walked between the aisles, and her bare feet were quiet on stone that 10,000 years of feet had worn smooth. The vault of the last names was the oldest building her people had ever raised. It was a single hall longer than a river, roofed in black stone, and every surface of it was carved with names. Not the names of the living, the names of the dead, the names of every world the devouring had eaten, every people it had swallowed, every voice it had silenced on its long march inward. That was the duty of Oresh. That was the only duty left. When a world went dark, the keepers carved its name into the stone so that something would remember it had ever lived. There were 940 worlds carved into the vault now. Sephi knew, because she had been made to count them, twice, as a punishment for looking up at the sky. 940 names, and soon, she understood, there would be 941, and the carver of the last one would be carving in the dark, and then there would be no one left to carve at all. She stopped in front of the newest name. The stone there was still pale where the chisel had cut it. It read, Talun, a world 4 jumps out. A green and gentle place that had sent grain to Oresh every harvest for longer than anyone could remember. Talun had gone dark 11 days ago. The carvers had worked through the night. Sephi had brought them water, and had not been thanked, because no one thanked anyone for anything anymore. Above the carved names, near the top of the great wall where the oldest carvings lived, there was a different kind of writing. It was not a name, it was a story, and it was so old that the keepers no longer fully believed it. Sephi had asked about it once, and the old archivist had told her it was a legend, a thing carved by frightened people long ago to comfort themselves, and that a wise keeper did not put her hope in legends. But Sephi was 11, and 11 is the age when you still read things you are told to ignore. The old carving said that long before the devouring came, before the first sun went dark, the keepers of Oresh had met a people from a small blue world very far away. The carving called them humans. It said the humans had been strange and loud and quick to laugh, and that they had stayed on Oresh for a season, and that when they left, they had made a promise. The promise was carved in letters taller than Sephi's whole body, so that no one could ever say it had been forgotten. The promise said, if the dark ever comes for you, light a fire we can see, and we will come. There was more to the old carving than the promise. Beneath it, in smaller letters, the first keepers had set down what little they remembered of the humans. They had come in a single ship, the carving said, not a fleet, one small wandering vessel that had crossed a gulf no one on Oresh could imagine, and had stopped at the temple world the way a traveler stops at a fire in the cold. They had been only a handful, a dozen perhaps, and they had been young, and they had walked among the keepers and learned the names on the wall and listened to the long sad story of the eaten sons. And when the keepers had told them, the way the keepers told everyone, that nothing could be done, that the devouring could not be fought, that all that was left was to remember, the humans had not agreed. The carving said the humans had grown very quiet when they heard it. The carving said one of them, a woman, had stood for a long time in front of the wall of names, with her hand pressed flat against the stone, and had said something the keepers did not understand, and carved down anyway, in the human tongue, in the only human words on the whole wall. No one alive on Oresh could read them, but they had been kept, all the same, for 10,000 years, because the woman had seemed to mean them, and the keepers of the last names did not let a thing be lost just because they did not understand it. The promise said, "If the dark ever comes for you, light a fire we can see, and we will come." And under it, the words no keeper could read, the words the human woman had spoken with her hand on the stone, waited in the dark of the high wall for someone who could. Sephi had read those words 100 times. She had run her small fingers along the deep-cut letters, until she knew every chip and crack of them, and she had believed, the way children believe, right up until the day the archivist explained to her that the humans were not real. There had never been a blue world, the archivist said. There had never been loud, laughing visitors. The humans were a story the old keepers had told, because hope was the only food they had, and a starving people will eat anything, even a lie. The devouring was real. The dark was real. The names on the wall were real. The humans were a comfort carved into stone by people who could not bear the truth. Sephi had cried that day, and had been told that crying was a waste of water. Now she stood under the great old promise, with the second sun gone out behind her, and she thought about the carving, and she thought about the dark coming, and she thought that it did not matter whether the humans had ever been real, because a legend cannot save anyone. A legend is just a wall. A wall does not come when you call. A bell began to ring at the far end of the vault. It was the deep bell, the one that was only rung when a sun died, and it meant the carvers would soon be at work again, cutting the name of whatever world had just lost its light. Sephi did not need to ask which world. She had felt the second sun go out on her own skin. It was their own sun. It was the sun of Oresh. The devouring had arrived. She did not run. There was nowhere to run to. She walked back to the pillar and picked up her broom, because that was her duty, and because a keeper kept her eyes on the floor, and because if she was going to die she had decided she would die doing the one small useful thing she knew how to do. She began to sweep. Outside the vault, the people of Oresh were gathering in the great square, under a sky, with only stars in it. Sephi could hear them through the open doors, the low murmur of a frightened crowd, the wail of the very young, the silence of the very old. The High Keeper would be standing on the steps soon, and he would tell them what he always told them, which was that the Keeper's duty was to remember, and that they would meet the dark with dignity, and that their names too would be carved by whoever came after. Except, there would be no one to come after. The carving would stop here. The wall would end with Oresh. Sephi swept her way toward the open doors, not because she wanted to hear the High Keeper, but because she wanted to see the dark sky one more time, even if it cost her another punishment, even if there was no one left to punish her. She set the broom down at the threshold and she looked up, the way she had been told 1,000 times never to do. The sky over Oresh was full of stars, and full of nothing else. The two suns were gone. The devouring hung where they had been, and you could see it now, faintly, a vast, slow churning in the dark, a thing too large for the eye to take in all at once, like watching a storm from inside a single raindrop. It was the color of a wound. It was beautiful in the way that only terrible things are beautiful, and it was reaching toward Oresh with the patience of something that had never once in all its long life failed to finish a meal. And Sephi, 11 turns old, with a broom at her feet and a legend at her back, did the only thing she could think to do. She turned and ran into the vault, past the carvers lifting their chisels, past the pale new wound where the name of her own world was about to be cut, all the way to the foot of the great old promise. And she looked up at the letters taller than her body. The words the archivist had told her were a lie. Light a fire we can see, and we will come. There was a brazier at the foot of the wall. There had always been a brazier there. The keepers kept it lit out of habit, out of ritual, out of a tradition so old that no one remembered it was meant to be a signal. It was not a large fire. It was not a fire anyone could see from space. But there were 940 names in that hall, and they had all been cut with oil-fed lamps, and there were barrels of that lamp oil stacked in the side passages, more than enough oil to keep 10,000 years of carving lit. Sephi was 11. She did not think it through. She did not weigh it. She simply did the thing that a child does when she has been told all her life to keep her eyes down and has finally, with the dark at the door, decided to look up. She grabbed the brazier in both hands, and it was hot, and it burned her, and she did not let go. The oil caught in the side passage like a living thing waking up. Sci-Fi had not planned past the brazier. She had carried it, burning her hands, to the mouth of the storehouse where the barrels of lamp oil stood in their cool rows, and she had set the flame against the nearest one, and then the world had turned to heat and light, and she had been thrown backward onto the stone. When she lifted her head, the whole side of the vault was burning. Not the names. The keepers had cut the names into bare stone, and stone does not burn. But the oil burned, and the wooden racks burned, and the great doors of the storehouse burned, and through the high windows of the vault, the fire threw its light up into the dark sky over Oresh. It was not a small fire anymore. It was a beacon. The carvers came running. The high keeper came running, his robes flying, his old face white with fury and fear. They thought the child had gone mad. They thought she had set fire to the holiest place on their world, the one building that held the memory of everything the devouring had ever taken. The high keeper seized Sci-Fi by the arm and shook her and shouted into her face, and she could see his mouth moving, but she could not hear him over the roar of the fire, and over something else, a deeper sound that had begun under the roar, a sound she felt in the soles of her feet before she heard it in her ears. She pointed up. The high keeper, still gripping her arm, looked up through the burning windows at the dark sky, and his shouting stopped. The devouring was still there, churning its slow wound-colored churn where the suns had been, but something had changed between it and Oresh. Across the black, where there had been only stars, a line of light had appeared. It was not the red of the devouring. It was white, hard, clean white, the white of a thing cutting through space at a speed the eye could barely follow, and it was not alone. Behind the first line there were others, 2, then 9, then more than anyone in the square below could count, a long bright spear of lights driving inward through the dark toward the dying world of Oresh. Someone in the square screamed that the devouring had brought more of itself. The high keeper, old and tired and certain, said quietly that nothing could move that fast, that it was a trick of grief, that the dark played such tricks on the dying. He said it the way the archivist had said the humans were not real. He said it because believing the alternative was harder than dying. And then the first of the white lights crossed the orbit of the dead suns, and slowed, and stopped, and it was a ship. It was a ship the size of a mountain range. It hung in the black above Oresh, lit along its hull by its own running lights, and on its gray flank, in letters the people of Oresh could not read, but would carve into stone forever after, was written a name in a strange alphabet, and the name was Long Memory. Behind it, the rest of the bright spear arrived and slowed and spread out across the sky over the temple world until the dark above Oresh was no longer dark at all. It was full of ships, hundreds of them, a fleet wide enough to roof a world. Sci-Fi stopped struggling against the high keeper's grip. He stopped gripping her. Together, the child and the old man and the carvers and the whole frightened crowd in the square below stood with their faces turned up to a sky they had been taught never to look at, and watched a legend become true. The old archivist was in the square that night, the same archivist who had told the child, years before, that the humans had never been real, that there had never been a blue world, that hope was the only food a starving people had, and so they had carved a lie and called it stone. He stood near the front of the crowd with his thin hands pressed over his mouth, and he watched the ships fall out of the dark, ship after ship after ship, more ships than there were names on the wall he had spent his whole life tending, and he made a small broken sound that no one heard over the roar of the fire. He had been so sure, he had been so careful. He had taught a generation of keepers to put no hope in legends, and he had taught it because the alternative, hoping and being wrong, year after year, death after death, was a thing he could not watch the young endure. And now the legend was falling out of the sky in front of him, and he understood that his care had been a kind of cruelty, and that the child he had made cry for believing had been right all along. He sank down where he stood. He did not kneel to the ships. He knelt to the child, though she could not see him, somewhere in the burning vault. He knelt to the one who had not stopped believing. The high keeper found his voice. It came out cracked and small. He said the word from the old carving, The word the archivist had buried, the word no living keeper had said aloud in earnest in 100 years. He said, "Humans." Aboard the long memory, in a room near the front of the great ship where the wide windows looked down on the temple world, a woman stood with her hands behind her back and read the fire. Her name was Captain Idris Vale, and she had been awake for 19 hours, and she had crossed a gulf of empty space that would have taken light itself a long while to cross, and she had done it because a fire had been lit on a world her people had promised, 10,000 years ago, never to forget. She was not young. There was gray at her temples, and a stillness in her that only long command can teach. She watched the burning vault through the window, and she did not speak for a long moment. The officer beside her, a younger man named Corin Hale, broke the silence. He said the signal had been faint. He said the automated listeners on the old relay had nearly filtered it out as ordinary fire. He said that if the watch officer on duty had been even slightly less careful, the fire on Aresh would have been logged as nothing, and the fleet would never have turned, and the world below them would have died alone. Captain Vale said that the watch officer had not been less careful, and that was why the fleet was here, and that was the end of that line of thought. She did not believe in dwelling on the near misses. There were too many of them in a long enough life, and dwelling on them only taught you to be afraid. But she knew the truth in what Hale said, even if she would not stand on it. The watch on Aresh was the oldest standing order her people had. 10,000 years before, in the first reach of humanity out into the dark, a single human ship had wandered farther than any had gone, into a quiet far cluster, and had found a temple world that kept the names of the dead. The humans had stayed a season. They had learned the keeper's grief, the long, slow loss of son after son, and they had made a promise they did not fully understand the weight of, because they were young then, and the young promise easily. Light a fire we can see, and we will come. Then they had gone home, and the order had been written down, and a relay had been left in the dark to listen, and the listening had been handed from watch to watch, from generation to generation, for 10,000 years. No fire ever came. The watch became a duty no one questioned and few believed in, the kind of thing a people keeps long after they have forgotten why, the way the keepers of Aresh kept a brazier lit at the foot of a promise, without remembering it was a signal. Vale had stood that watch herself, as a young officer, a single dull rotation listening to a relay that had heard nothing in 10,000 years. She had thought it a waste, then, the way the young think things are wastes. She did not think so now. She thought of all the watch officers down all the long centuries who had listened to silence and kept faith anyway, who had passed the order on rather than let it die, who had refused, generation after generation, to be the ones who decided the legend was only a legend, and stopped listening. The fleet was here because they had not stopped. The world below was alive because 10,000 years of bored, faithful humans had kept a promise none of them ever expected to be asked to keep. That, Vale thought, was the thing the keepers down there would never quite understand about her people. The humans had not come because they were brave. They had come because they had said they would, and a very long time ago they had learned, the hard way, on 100 worlds of their own, that a promise you only keep when it is easy is not a promise at all. She turned from the window. The bridge of the long memory was quiet and full of light. Around her, men and women sat at their stations and read the readings of the thing in the dark, the wound-colored churn that the people below called the devouring, and their faces were grim. Vale had been told the legends of this place before the fleet ever set out. Every human child was told them. The promise carved on the temple world, the people who kept the names of the dead, the hungry thing that ate sons. For 10,000 years the humans had kept watch on this distant cluster from afar, listening for a fire, and for 10,000 years no fire had come, and the keeping of the watch had become a ritual, a duty handed down, a story told to children, a thing half believed. And then, an hour ago, the fire had come. After 10,000 years, which meant the story was not a story, which meant the thing that ate sons was real, and it had finally reached the world at the center, and it had been eating its way inward this whole time, sun by sun, world by world, while the humans listened from far away, and the keepers carved names into stone. Vale looked at the readings of the devouring and felt something she did not let show on her face. It was not fear exactly. Her people did not run from things, but it was respect, the cold, clear respect a sailor feels for a storm. The thing in the dark was enormous. It was old. The reading said it was not one creature, but a vast knit swarm of them, untold billions of bodies moving as one will, and that the will at the heart of the swarm was the oldest living thing the fleet's instruments had ever measured. It had been eating stars since before the humans had words. It had never, in all that time, failed to finish what it began. Corin Hale said quietly that the fleet's records held no defeat of a thing like this. He said there was no plan in the books. He said they were the first humans ever to stand in front of the devouring, and the books could not tell them how to win, because no one had ever tried. Captain Vale said that this was true. Then she said that it did not change what they were going to do. Down in the burning vault, Sephi pulled free of the High Keeper at last, and ran to the great open doors, and looked up at the ships. The fire she had lit was still roaring behind her, throwing her small shadow long across the square. The people of Oresh were on their knees now, all of them, the way they knelt to nothing, the way they had been too frightened and too proud to kneel even to the devouring. They knelt to the sky. Sephi did not kneel. She was 11, and she had burned her hands, and she had lit the fire, and she felt that having done that thing she had earned the right to stand. She looked up at the ship called Long Memory, the mountain in the sky, and she thought about the archivist who had told her the humans were a lie, and she thought, with the fierce, uncomplicated joy of a child who has been proven right, that she could not wait to find that old man and tell him. A light came down from the great ship. It was a single small craft, dropping fast and then slowing, settling onto the wide steps of the vault with a sound like a long sigh. Its hull was gray and scarred, and marked with the same strange alphabet as the great ship above. A hatch opened in its side, and the people of Oresh, 10,000 years after the promise had been carved, met a human face to face, for the first time since the legend began. Captain Idris Vale walked down the ramp of the small craft and onto the steps of the vault, and she stopped, and she looked at the kneeling crowd, and she looked at the burning storehouse, and she looked at the great wall of carved names visible through the open doors, 940 worlds remembered in stone, and then she looked at the one small figure who was not kneeling, the child with the burned hands standing at the top of the steps, and something in her stern face changed. She did not speak the language of Oresh. No human did. The legend had been carved in stone precisely because the two peoples had never been able to talk except through the slow, patient work of pointing and drawing. But Vale had been ready for this. She knelt down on the step so that her eyes were level with the child's, and she held up her own two hands, palms out, and turned them so the child could see them. They were scarred too, old burns. Vale had been a young engineer once, long ago, and fire had marked her the way it now marked Sephi. She showed the child her burned hands, and she nodded, slow and certain, and Sephi understood. The nod said, "You lit the fire." The nod said, "I see what it cost you." The nod said, "It worked." Sephi held up her own burned hands, and she nodded back, and a great many of the keepers of Oresh, watching, began to weep, because the gesture needed no language, and because for the first time in 940 deaths, someone had come. The High Keeper came forward, slow on his old legs, and he tried to speak, and could not. And so he did the only thing he could think to do. He turned and gestured to the great wall of names, and then he gestured to the burning sky, and then he made, with his trembling hands, the shape of the thing that ate suns. He was telling her. He was warning her. He was saying, "This is what comes. This is what we cannot fight. You should not have come. You should fly away while the dark is still over us, and not yet upon you." Captain Vale stood up. She looked where the old keeper pointed, at the wound-colored churn in the sky, and then she did something that the keepers of Oresh would carve into the stone wall for as long as the wall endured, a thing they would tell their children, a thing the child Sephi would tell her own children when she was old. The captain of the Long Memory looked the devouring full in the face, the thing that had eaten 940 worlds and never once been stopped, and she smiled. It was not a cruel smile. It was not a frightened smile. It was the smile of someone who has finally, after a very long wait, found the thing she came to do. She turned to the old keeper, and she pointed at the great wall of 940 names, and then she held up one finger and shook her head, slow and clear. "No more." The gesture said, "No more names. The wall ends here, but not the way you think. It ends because the dark ends here, not the world. The High Keeper did not understand the words, because there were no words. But he understood the finger, and the shake of the head, and the smile that was not afraid, and he sat down hard on the steps of his own temple, and wept like a child. Above them, the fleet of the humans turned in the dark, all of it at once, hundreds of mountains of gray metal swinging their great fronts toward the churning wound where the suns had been, and the devouring, which had eaten suns since before the humans had words, which had never failed to finish a meal, paused. It paused. The instruments aboard the long memory caught it. The vast, slow churn of the swarm hesitated, just for a moment, the way a thing hesitates when a sound reaches it that it has never heard before. For 10,000 years and 940 worlds, the devouring had eaten in silence, because nothing in the dark had ever come to meet it. The keepers carved names. The worlds went quiet. The dark advanced. That was the order of things. That was the only order the devouring had ever known. Now there were hundreds of ships in front of it that should not exist, lit along their hulls, turning their fronts toward it with intent, and at the heart of the oldest living thing in the cluster, something stirred that had not stirred in a very long time. It was not fear. The devouring did not have fear, any more than a flood has fear, but it was the thing that comes before fear in a creature that has never met its match. It was attention. The swarm was paying attention. Captain Vale walked back up the ramp of her small craft, and the child Sephi, before she could think better of it, ran after her. The keepers cried out. The High Keeper reached for her and missed. But Sephi was small and quick, and she had lit the fire, and she had decided, with the whole stubborn certainty of 11 turns old, that she was not going to watch this from the floor of the vault with her eyes down. She had looked up. She was going to keep looking up. Vale heard the small feet on the ramp, and turned. She looked at the child standing in the hatch of her craft, breathing hard, burned hands clenched, terrified, and absolutely refusing to leave. And the captain of the long memory, who had crossed a gulf of empty space on the strength of one small fire, made a decision that was not in any book. She stood aside and let the child come aboard. The hatch closed. The small craft lifted from the steps of the vault and climbed back up toward the mountain in the sky, and through its narrow window the child Sephi watched her whole world fall away beneath her, the burning storehouse, the great square full of kneeling people, the dark sea, the dead suns. She had never been off the ground in her life. She had never been higher than the temple roof. Now she rose through the air and into the black, and the air thinned and the stars hardened, and ahead of her the ship called Long Memory grew from a mountain into a continent, into a sky of its own. And beyond it, filling the dark from edge to edge, the devouring waited, paying attention for the first time in 10,000 years, and the human fleet turned its hundreds of fronts to meet it. The small craft slid into the belly of the Long Memory, and the great ship swallowed it whole. Sephi stepped out onto a floor that hummed under her bare feet, into a vast, bright cavern of metal, full of more humans than she had ever imagined existing. They moved with purpose, fast and quiet, and not one of them stopped to stare at the alien child in the temple keeper's gray robe, because they had a war to fight, and no time for staring. A young human in a worker's coverall pressed a small device into Sephi's hand, and folded her fingers around it, and pointed at her own ear, and Sephi understood that she was meant to hold it there. She did. A voice spoke inside her head, in her own language, in the language of Aresh that no human could speak. The voice said, "This device will let you understand us. Stay close to the captain. Do not touch the red panels. You are safe here." Sephi had not heard the word safe in a long time. She did not entirely believe it, but she held the device to her ear, and she followed the captain through the bright cavern and up through the body of the great ship toward its front, and everywhere she looked, there were humans working, and not one of them was afraid, and that was the strangest thing of all. Her whole world had lived in fear for 940 deaths. These people, standing in front of the same dark, were not afraid. She did not understand how that was possible. She decided she wanted to. They came to the bridge, the high bright room at the front of the Long Memory, where the wide windows looked down on the temple world and out at the devouring. Captain Vale took her place at the center of it. Sephi was set on a small seat to one side, out of the way, and told through the device in her ear to watch and stay quiet. And she did, because for once in her life she had no wish to do anything else. Through the great windows she could see it all. Below and behind, the dark sea of Oresh, the world she had been born on, the only world she had ever known, small now and fragile as a dropped cup. Ahead, the wound-colored churn of the devouring, vast beyond the eye, filling the dark where the suns had been. And between them, spread across the black, the human fleet. Hundreds of ships. She tried to count them, and gave up at 60. The voice in her ear, without being asked, told her there were 311. Captain Vale spoke, and her words came into Seffi's ear in the language of Oresh, and the child understood that she was hearing a thing very few of her people would ever hear, the sound of humans deciding how to save a world. The captain asked her officers to tell her what the devouring was. A woman at a far station answered. She said it was a swarm. She said it was not one body but uncounted billions of them, small things each no larger than a ship's boat, knit together by a will so old and so deep that they moved as one mind, one purpose, one hunger. She said the swarm ate stars the way a fire eats wood, swarming a sun in its billions, and drinking its light and its heat, and its very substance, until the star went cold and dark, and then moving inward to the next. She said the swarm had no homeworld, no ships, no machines, nothing to break, because it was not a fleet. It was an appetite that had learned to fly. Corin Hale, the young officer at the captain's side, said the hard part plainly. He said you could not sink an appetite. He said you could burn 1,000,000 of the swarm bodies, and the swarm would not even notice, the way a man does not notice losing a few hairs. He said the old will at the heart of it was the only thing that mattered, the single ancient mind that drove the billions, and that the readings could not find it, because it hid itself deep in the churn where no scan could reach, and that until they found it, they were swatting at smoke. Seffi listened to all of this through the device in her ear, and she felt the old familiar fear creeping back into her chest, the fear she had lived in her whole life. The humans were describing the devouring exactly as the keepers had always known it, a thing with no body to break, a hunger with no heart you could reach, a dark that could not be fought, only carved into a wall and grieved. For a moment, the child thought that the humans, for all their ships and all their light, were going to learn what her people had always known, that the devouring could not be beaten, that the fire she had lit had only brought more of them to die. She looked at the captain and waited for the captain's face to fall the way every face on Oresh had fallen for 940 deaths. The captain's face did not fall. Seffi watched her and slowly understood that she was watching a different kind of person look at the same problem. The keepers of Oresh had looked at the devouring and seen a thing too large to fight. The captain looked at the same thing and saw, the child realized, a thing that had to do something it could not do from hiding. The captain was not looking at the swarm. She was looking, Seffi saw, at the one thing the woman at the far station had said almost in passing. The thing about the hidden will, the single old mind that drove the billions, the heart that no scan could reach because it hid in the deep churn. The keepers had heard that the heart could not be found and despaired. The captain had heard that the heart had to hide, and gone very still, the way a hunter goes still when it understands at last where the great beast must come to drink. Corin Hale saw the captain go still and said, carefully, that he knew that look and that he did not yet know the plan, but that he would like to, before the fleet committed to it. Captain Vale almost smiled. She said the plan was simple, and that simple plans were the only kind that survived contact with a thing this old. She said the heart could hide from a scan. She said it could not hide from its own hunger. Captain Vale listened to the last of her officers with her hands behind her back. When they had finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking out the great window at the thing that ate suns. And then she gave her first order, and it was not the order Seffi expected. She did not order the fleet to attack. She ordered the fleet to make a light. Seffi did not understand. The voice in her ear gave her the captain's words but not their meaning. But she watched, and she saw the 311 ships of the human fleet move in the dark, sliding into a great curved line, a long shallow bowl of metal facing the devouring, and she saw the front of every ship begin to glow. Not with weapons, with light. A clean, hard white light, growing brighter along the whole curved line, until the human fleet hung in the black like a second dawn, like the suns the devouring had eaten reborn all at once, and far brighter than before. The devouring reacted. Sephi saw it through the window. The wound-colored churn shifted, swelled, turned toward the light, the way a vast, slow tide turns toward the pull of a moon, and she understood, all at once, with the quick, clear understanding of a child, what the captain had done. The swarm ate light. The swarm hunted light. For 10,000 years the swarm had moved from sun to sun, drawn inward by the light of stars, and the humans had just lit, in the cold dark in front of it, the brightest light it had ever seen. The captain had not attacked the devouring. She had called it. She had made of her own fleet a fire too bright to ignore, a lure no appetite that old could resist, and the swarm, which hid its ancient will deep in its billions where no scan could reach, was now turning all of itself, every body, every part, the whole vast churn of it, toward the human light, toward the bait, Corin Hale said, low, that the swarm was committing. He said the readings showed the whole mass moving as one, the billions and the will that drove them, all of it pivoting to feed on the fleet's light. He said that when a thing that old and that hungry turned all of itself toward a single point, there was a moment, just a moment, when its hidden heart had to come up out of the deep churn to steer, because nothing could aim billions of bodies at once from behind cover. He said the heart would surface. He said when it did, they would have it for a heartbeat, no longer. Captain Vale said one word. She said, ready. Across the human fleet, in 311 ships, the lights stayed bright and burning, the brightest fire the dark had ever held, and behind the light, hidden in the glare, the great fronts of the warships opened, and what was behind the light was not light at all. The devouring came on. Sephi watched the wound-colored churn surge across the black toward the human dawn, faster than she had ever imagined a thing that size could move. Billions of bodies pouring forward in a tide that blotted out the stars, the oldest hunger in the cluster rushing to feed on the brightest meal it had ever been offered. It did not slow. It did not suspect. For 10,000 years, nothing had ever met it in the dark, and so it had never learned that light could be a lie. And as it surged, as the whole mass committed, the readings caught what Corin Hale had promised. From deep in the churn, rising up to steer the great rush, came the heart of the devouring, the ancient will, the single oldest living thing in the cluster, surfacing for one heartbeat to aim its billions at the bait. The voice in Sephi's ear went quiet. She looked at Captain Vale. The captain of the long memory watched the heart of the devouring surface in her instruments, the thing that had eaten 940 worlds, the thing her people had crossed a gulf of empty space to meet. She did not gloat. She did not shout. She simply looked at it, the way you look at a thing you have waited a very long time to find. And then she gave the order the books did not have, because no human had ever stood where she stood, and she had decided what the books would say from now on. She said, now. The light of the human fleet, the bright lure that had drawn the swarm across the dark, went out all at once, every ship, every glow, snuffed in a single instant. And in the sudden dark, before the devouring could understand that the meal it had committed to was gone, the warships fired. Sephi had never seen a weapon larger than a keeper's knife. She had no word for what the human fleet did in the dark above her world. The great fronts of 311 warships opened and spoke as one, and the black between the fleet and the surfaced heart of the devouring, filled with lances of hard white fire, not aimed at the billions, not wasted on the smoke, but driven all together, the whole fleet's fury focused into one narrow killing line, straight at the one place the swarm had been forced to bring its ancient will up into the open. The heart of the devouring had no machine to break, no hull, no armor. It was the oldest living thing in the cluster, and it had ruled by hiding, and the humans had made it stop hiding for one single heartbeat, and one heartbeat was all they needed. The light reached it. Sephi shut her eyes against the glare, and even through her eyelids the bridge turned white, and the device in her ear gave her no words, because there were no words, only the long rolling thunder of 311 warships striking the same point in the dark at the same instant. When she opened her eyes, the heart of the devouring was burning, not the swarm, the will, the single ancient mind that had driven the billions inward sun by sun for 10,000 years, was burning in the dark above Oresh, and the wound-colored churn around it, the uncounted bodies that had no thought of their own, began to come apart. Far below, on the floor of Oresh, the whole world saw it. The keepers in the square, the carvers with their dropped chisels, the old archivist on his knees, the high keeper with his face turned up to a sky he had spent his life teaching others to ignore. They saw the dark above their world split with a light brighter than the suns the devouring had eaten, a single hard white line lancing across the black and striking the great wound-colored churn in the one place it had let itself be seen. They did not understand the trap that had drawn the heart up into the open. They did not understand the lure of light, or the snuffing of it, or the patient months of human listening that had made any of it possible. They only saw the dark, which had taken 940 worlds and never once been struck, get struck. And a sound went up from the square of Oresh that had not been heard on that world in living memory, a sound the keepers had no name for, because it had been so long since they made it. It was a cheer, a whole world, on its knees, cheering, the way the drowning cheer the sight of a rope. Sephi heard it through the open distance, faintly, even from the bridge of the great ship, and the device in her ear did not translate it, because it needed no translation. She knew that sound. She had made it herself, a few hours before, alone at the foot of the wall, with a burning brazier in her hands. It was the sound of someone who has been told all her life to keep her eyes down, looking up, and finding the sky on fire in her favor for the first time. Corin Hale said, very quietly, that they had hit it. He said the central will was failing. He said the swarm was losing its mind, the billions scattering, the great knit purpose unraveling thread by thread now that the thing that held it together was burning. Captain Vale did not celebrate. She watched the heart of the devouring burn, and she said, lo, that it was not finished. She said a thing that old did not die from one wound. She said the will was hurt, badly, mortally perhaps, but that it would try to flee back down into the deep churn to heal, the way it had healed from every other hurt in 10,000 years, except that there had never been any other hurt, because nothing had ever struck it before. She said this was the dangerous part. A wounded thing that has never been wounded does not know how to die. It only knows how to run. And the heart of the devouring, burning, ran. The readings caught it diving back down into the scattering billions, trailing fire, the ancient will fleeing the light the way it had fled nothing in all its long life, pulling the loose threads of the swarm around itself like a cloak, trying to hide, trying to heal, trying to do the one thing it had always done, which was survive to eat again. Captain Vale watched it run, and then she turned, for just a moment, and looked at the alien child sitting silent on the small seat to the side of her bridge, the child who had burned her hands to light a fire so that this moment could happen, and the captain made a small nod, the same nod she had given on the temple steps. The nod said, I see what it cost you. The nod said, it is not finished. The nod said, watch. Then she turned back to the dark, and to the wounded ancient thing fleeing into it, and she ordered the long memory to give chase. The long memory dove after the wounded thing, and the rest of the fleet came with it. Sephi gripped the edge of her seat as the great ship surged forward, though she felt no motion, only saw the dark sky outside the windows begin to move, the scattering billions of the swarm sliding past as the human fleet drove into the churn after the fleeing heart. She had thought the battle was won. The captain's face told her it was not. The captain was leaning forward now, watching the readings, and there was no smile on her face anymore, only the cold focus of a hunter who has wounded a great beast and knows that a wounded beast is the most dangerous kind. Corin Hale said the wounded will was diving for the third sun. Sephi did not understand at first. The voice in her ear gave her the words, and she turned them over, and then the cold understanding came. There had been 2 suns over Oresh, and the devouring had eaten them both. But the cluster had a third sun, the old dim one far out at the edge, the one the keepers called the Watcher, the cold red star that had hung at the rim of the sky for as long as anyone could remember. The Watcher was dying on its own, slow and natural, a star at the end of its life. But it still burned. It still held light and heat and substance enough to feed an appetite, and the wounded heart of the devouring was fleeing toward it, not to fight, but to feed, to drink the old red star down to nothing, and use its light to heal the wound the humans had cut. Captain Vale understood it before Hale finished speaking. She said that if the will reached the Watcher, it would feed, and if it fed, it would heal, and if it healed, it would learn. She said that a thing which had never been wounded would, the moment it survived being wounded, become something far worse than it had been. Because for the first time in 10,000 years, it would know fear, and it would never again surface to steer, and it would never again be drawn out into the open by a light, and the next world it came for, no fleet would be able to save. She said the chance was now, in the dark above Oresh, with the will hurt and running. There would not be another. She ordered the fleet to cut the wounded heart off from the Watcher. Corin Hale gave the orders to the fleet, fast and clear, and Sephi watched the readings change, the 311 ships breaking from their killing line and spreading wide across the dark, a great net of gray metal flung between the fleeing thing and the old red star at the rim of the sky. The captain stood over the readings and named the moves before they happened, the way a keeper who has carved the same words 10,000 times knows the next stroke before the chisel falls. She sent the swiftest ships wide and low to close the long way around. She held the heavy ships back to wall the short way. She kept the long memory at the center, where she could see all of it, where she could move the fleet the way a hand moves. And she did not raise her voice once. And Sephi understood that this was its own kind of strength, the strength to stay quiet and certain while a thing 10,000 years old fought for its life in front of you. The child had thought, when the heart began to burn, that the war was nearly over. She understood now that the burning had only been the start. The captain had said it. A thing that has never been wounded does not know how to die. It only knows how to run. And so the hardest part of the whole night was not the killing of the heart, but the chase that came after, the long, patient work of keeping a dying god from reaching the water. And Sephi watched it unfold and learned, in one night, more about how a thing is truly beaten than her people had learned in 940 deaths. You did not beat the dark by being braver than it. You beat it by understanding, better than it understood itself, the one thing it could not help but reach for, and by being already standing there when it reached. What followed, Sephi watched through the great windows and did not have words for, then or ever. The human fleet, 311 ships, split and curved and raced through the scattering billions of the swarm, driving to put themselves between the fleeing will and the old red star. The swarm fought them. It was mindless now, its great purpose unraveled, but billions of bodies, even without a mind, are still billions of bodies, and they flung themselves against the human ships in a blind tide, a storm of small hungry things battering the gray hulls, swarming the windows, blotting out the stars. Sephi saw the dark outside the bridge fill with them, with the wound-colored bodies of the swarm crashing against the front of the long memory, and she cried out before she could stop herself. The voice in her ear said, "The hull holds. The hull always holds." And it did. The great ship drove through the storm of bodies, as a ship drives through surf, and the swarm broke against it, and was thrown aside, and the long memory did not slow, and did not turn, and did not fail. Around it the rest of the fleet did the same, 311 mountains of gray metal plowing through a tide of mindless hunger, and the swarm could not stop them, because the swarm no longer had a mind to plan with, because the humans had burned its mind in the dark, and all that was left was appetite without a will to aim it. The fleet reached the line between the fleeing heart and the old red star, and closed it. Sephi saw the wounded will throw itself against that line. The readings showed it, a knot of trailing fire driving for the Watcher, with all the desperate strength of a thing that had never in 10,000 years needed to be desperate. It struck the human line, and the human line held. The warships poured their hard white fire across the dark, not at the billions now, but at the one wounded thing, hurting it, blocking it, turning it back from the red star every time it lunged, and Sephi understood that the captain was not trying to kill it anymore. She was trying to keep it from feeding. She was trying to make it bleed out. It took a long time. Sephi did not know how long. Time on the bridge of the long memory moved strangely, stretched thin by fear and wonder. She watched the wounded heart of the devouring lunge for the red star and be turned back, and lunge again, and be turned back again, each lunge a little weaker than the last, the trailing fire of its wound a little dimmer, the great churn of the scattered swarm around it thinning as the billions, with no mind to hold them, began simply to drift apart into the dark and go cold. Sephi lost track of how many times the dying thing lunged and was turned. She counted, at first, the way she had been taught to count names, because counting was the one thing she knew how to do when she was afraid. She counted 9 lunges, then 12, then stopped, because the lunges had begun to blur together, each one a little weaker. Each one met by the same wall of hard white fire, the human ships holding their net across the dark, and giving the dying god not one finger's width of room to slip past toward the red star. The keepers of Oresh, watching from the floor of their world, would later say it looked like a storm trapped under glass, a great wound-colored fury, throwing itself again and again against a thing it could not break, and going dimmer every time. The voice in Sephi's ear, the patient voice that had told her she was safe, spoke once during the chase, unasked. It said that the captain was not in a hurry. It said that a thing that had eaten for 10,000 years had a great deal of strength to spend, and that the fleet would not waste itself trying to end it fast. It said the humans would simply stand in its way, and stand, and let the dying thing spend its last strength against them, because they had learned long ago that patience was a weapon too, and that the side which could not be moved would always, in the end, outlast the side that had to move. Sephi did not fully understand it then. She understood it for the rest of her life. The keepers of Oresh had been patient too, in their way, patiently carving names, patiently grieving, patiently waiting to die. The humans were patient in the other direction. They had waited 10,000 years to keep a promise, and they could wait an hour more to keep it right. And then, at the end, the wounded thing stopped lunging. Corin Hale said, very quietly, that it was dying. He said the will was failing at last. He said 10,000 years of hunger were going out in the dark above Oresh, the oldest living thing in the cluster guttering like a lamp that has finally, after burning longer than anyone could remember, run out of oil. But the captain's face had not eased. She was watching one reading, and her jaw was tight, and Sephi followed her eyes to the great window and saw that the dying will had stopped lunging for the red star because it had found something else to reach for. It had turned, in its last strength, away from the Watcher and back the way it had come, back toward the dark sea and the dropped cup fragility of the small world at the center, back toward Oresh. The voice in Sephi's ear was silent. She understood without it. The wounded thing could not reach the red star. The human fleet had cut it off, but the wounded thing was dying, and it had decided, with the last of its ancient malice, that if it could not feed, it would at least eat one final meal on its way out. It would take the temple world. It would swallow the 940 names. It would make the last world the same as all the others, silent and cold, before the humans could stop it. A thing that has never been wounded does not know how to die with grace. It only knows how to take. Captain Vale saw it turn for the world, and she did the thing that, of everything that happened in the dark above Oresh, the keepers would carve largest of all into the great wall. The thing the child Sephi would carry in her chest for the rest of her long life. She ordered the long memory between the dying thing and the world. Corin Hale started to say something. Sephi saw it on his face. The protest. The careful officer's reminder that the flagship was the heart of the fleet. That there were other ways. That a captain did not put her own ship in the path of a falling star out of spite or pride. But Captain Vale was already giving the order. Calm and clear. And her officers were already obeying. Because they were human. And because they had crossed a gulf of empty space on the strength of one small fire, and because they had not come all this way to let the last world die at the very end. The long memory drove forward and put itself, 311 ships strong with the flagship at the point, directly between the dying heart of the devouring and the dropped cup of Oresh. And the dying thing, with the last of its 10,000 years, threw itself at the great gray ship in one final tide. Sephi shut her eyes. The bridge shook. For the first time since she had come aboard, the great ship that did not seem to move, moved, shuddering under the impact of the dying swarm, and the wounded will at its heart flinging itself against the human hull with everything it had left. The lights on the bridge flickered. Somewhere deep in the ship, something groaned. A long, low sound of metal under a weight it had not been built to hold. Sephi gripped her seat and waited to die. The way she had been waiting to die since the second sun went out, and the voice in her ear, after a long silence, spoke again. It said, "The hull holds." She opened her eyes. The bridge was steady, the lights had come back, and through the great window, the dying heart of the devouring was sliding off the front of the long memory, spent, broken, its last tide thrown and failed, the ancient will guttering out at last against a gray hull that had not given way. The humans had taken its final blow and not moved. The thing that had eaten 940 worlds and never once been stopped had thrown itself against the last world's last defender and broken on it like surf on a cliff. And then it was simply gone. The readings showed it. The trailing fire winked out. The ancient will, the oldest living thing in the cluster, the heart that had driven the billions inward sun by sun for 10,000 years, went cold and dark and ended. And without it, the last of the scattered swarm, the billions of mindless bodies still drifting in the churn, had nothing left to hold them together, and they came apart into the dark, cooling, falling, dying, until the great wound-colored churn that had filled the sky over Oresh thinned and faded and was not there anymore. The dark over the temple world was just dark again, just stars, just empty, ordinary, beautiful dark with no hunger in it. But the long memory had not come through whole. Sephi felt it before she understood it. The bridge was steady, but it was wrong. The hum she had felt under her feet since she came aboard, the deep living hum of the great ship, had changed. It had gone ragged. Lights were red along one whole wall of the bridge now, the red panels she had been told not to touch, and humans were moving fast and quiet and grim, and the voice in her ear had stopped saying that everything was safe. Corin Hale was speaking low and fast to the captain. Sephi caught the shape of it through the device in her ear. The flagship had taken the dying thing's last blow at the point of the line, and the hull had held. The hull had held, but holding had cost it. Deep in the great ship, where the dying will had struck hardest, something at the heart of the long memory was failing. Not the way a lamp fails when it runs out of oil. The way a great old tree fails when the storm that could not knock it down has nonetheless cracked it through. The long memory was dying. Sephi looked at Captain Vale. The captain had heard the report. She did not flinch, and she did not show fear. But Sephi, who had spent her whole short life watching the faces of frightened people, saw the thing pass behind the captain's eyes, the quick, cold arithmetic of a commander who has just been told the price of the victory she chose. The flagship had put itself in the path of the falling star to save the last world, and it had saved it, and it would not now be sailing home. The captain looked out the great window at the clean dark over Oresh, the dark with no hunger in it, the world she had saved, and then she turned and looked at the alien child on the small seat to the side of her bridge, the child who had lit the fire, the child she had let come aboard against every rule in the book. And Captain Idris Vale of the long memory did the cold arithmetic one more time, and made her last decision, and began to give the orders that would get every soul she could off her dying ship before it went into the dark. The order to abandon the long memory went out across the great ship in a calm, clear voice, and 10,000 humans began to leave their flagship without panic. That was the thing Sephi would remember longest, longer even than the burning of the heart in the dark. There was no screaming. There was no trampling. The humans moved through the failing corridors of their dying ship, the way the keepers had once hoped to meet the dark, with order and with dignity, helping the slow, carrying the hurt, leaving in good time and in good order, toward the small craft and the waiting ships of the fleet. They had built a vessel that could fight a thing that ate suns, and they had built a people who could lose that vessel without losing themselves. And Sephi understood, watching them, that the second was the harder thing to build, and the rarer. A young human came for her, the one who had given her the device for her ear, and tried to lead her toward a small craft. Sephi pulled free. She ran back to the bridge. She did not entirely know why. She only knew that the captain who had shown her her burned hands, the captain who had let her come aboard, the captain who had put the whole great ship between the dying thing and the world, was still on the bridge, and that Sephi was not going to leave her there alone. The bridge was nearly empty when the child reached it. The officers had gone to their stations across the dying ship to oversee the leaving. Only a few remained, and Corin Hale, and at the center of it, alone before the great window, Captain Idris Vale. She turned when Sephi came in. She did not look surprised. She looked, Sephi thought, the way the High Keeper had looked on the temple steps when the ships came down out of the dark, like someone seeing a thing she had been told was only a legend. The captain knelt down, the way she had on the temple steps, so that her eyes were level with the child's, and through the device in Sephi's ear, for the first time, she spoke to her directly, and her words came soft and clear in the language of Oresh. She said, "You have to go now." Sci-Fi shook her head. She did not have many human words, and she did not need them. She pointed at the captain, and then at herself, and then she folded her arms, the universal gesture of a child who has decided to stay. Captain Vale smiled. It was the same smile she had given the devouring on the temple steps, the smile of someone who has found the thing she came to do, except that now it was gentler, and there was something in it that Sci-Fi was too young to name but would understand when she was old. The captain reached out and took the child's burned hands in her own scarred ones, very carefully, because they both knew how those hands hurt. She said, "Someone has to stay with the ship. A ship like this one is not just metal. It carried us across the dark. It stood in front of the falling star. It will not go into the dark alone, because that is not how we do things. But there is no reason for two to stay. And you," she said, "you have a world down there that needs you. You lit the fire. You are the one who called us. You do not get to stay up here in the dark with an old ship. You have to go back down and tell them what happened. You have to be the one who carves it into the wall." Sci-Fi did not understand all the words. She understood enough. She understood that the captain was going to stay with the long memory, and that the long memory was going to go into the dark, and that the captain wanted her to go home. And the child who had decided, with the whole stubborn certainty of 11 turns old, that she would never again keep her eyes down, found that she could not stop the tears, and did not try, because she was no longer on a world where crying was a waste of water. Captain Vale stood. She nodded to Corin Hale, and the young officer came and gently took the child's hand, and this time Sci-Fi did not pull free, because the captain had asked her, and because the captain had given her a duty, and a keeper does her duty. But at the door of the bridge, Sci-Fi turned back one last time, and she looked at the captain standing alone before the great window with the clean dark and the saved world beyond it, and she did the only thing she could think to do. She held up her two burned hands, palms out, the way the captain had on the temple steps. And she nodded. The nod said, "I see what it cost you." The nod said, "It worked." The nod said, "I will remember." And Captain Idris Vale, alone on the bridge of her dying flagship, held up her own two scarred hands and nodded back. Then Corin Hale led the child away, and the door closed, and that was the last time anyone but the dark ever saw the captain of the long memory. The small craft fell away from the great ship and dropped back down toward Oresh, and Sci-Fi pressed her face to the narrow window and watched the long memory grow small behind her, the mountain in the sky shrinking back into a single point of light among the cold stars. The rest of the fleet had pulled away to a safe distance, 310 ships now, holding their stations in the clean dark, and as Sci-Fi watched, the point of light that was the long memory began to glow, not red like the devouring, but white, the clean, hard white the fleet had used to make the lure, the captain lighting up her dying ship one last time, so that the fleet, and the watching world below, and the child falling home, could see it go. It was beautiful. Sci-Fi would say that, when she was old and the children of Oresh sat at her feet and asked her how it ended. She would tell them that the dying of the long memory was the most beautiful thing she ever saw, a single white star kindling in the dark where the captain had chosen to stay, burning clean and bright and unafraid, and then growing brighter still, and brighter, until for one instant there were two suns over Oresh again, two suns where the devouring had eaten two, a last gift of light from a people who had crossed a gulf of empty space because of one small fire. And then the light faded, slow and gentle, the way a sun should fade and never had under the devouring, and was gone, and the long memory with it, into the dark, alone but not alone, because that was not how the humans did things. The small craft set down on the steps of the vault of the last names, as the sky over Oresh paled toward a dawn that, for the first time in 940 deaths, was not feeding the dark. The people were still in the square. They had not moved. They had watched the whole of it from the floor of their world, the lure and the burning of the heart and the chase, and the dying thing thrown back, and the great ship choosing to stand in the falling star's path. And they had watched the white star kindle and brighten into two suns and fade, and they had understood, in the wordless way that the largest things are understood, what it had cost and who had paid it. And when the child Sci-Fi came down the ramp of the small craft, alone, with her burned hands and her tear-streaked face, the whole world of Oresh rose from its knees, not to kneel again, but to stand, because the child had taught them, in one night, that a keeper of the last names could also look up. The High Keeper came to her. The old man who had told her the humans were a lie, who had shaken her, and shouted at her on these same steps a few hours before. He knelt down in front of the child, the High Keeper of all Oresh, kneeling to an 11-turn keeper of the floor, and he wept, and he asked her, in a broken voice, what they should carve. And Sephi, who had spent her whole short life being told to keep her eyes down, looked up at the great wall of the vault, at the 940 names of the dead worlds, and at the ancient promise carved in letters taller than her body, the promise the archivist had called a lie. Light a fire we can see, and we will come. She told the High Keeper what to carve. She told him to carve that the promise had been kept. She told him to carve the name of the ship, the strange word she could not read but would never forget. The word long memory, in letters as tall as the promise itself, so that it stood beside it forever. She told him to carve the captain's name, Idris Vale, which the young officer Corin Hale had given her before the fleet departed, kneeling on the steps and pressing the sounds into the device in her ear, over and over, until the child had them perfectly, because a name, Hale said, was the one thing the humans never let the dark have, and Vale would want hers said right. And then she told the High Keeper the last thing to carve, and it was the thing that changed Oresh forever, the thing that turned the vault of the last names from a tomb into something else. She told him to carve, beneath the name of every one of the 940 dead worlds, that they had been avenged, that the thing which ate them was dead, that the dark had been stopped, here, above Oresh, by a child's fire and a captain's choice, and that it would not come again. She told him that the vault was not a wall of the lost anymore, it was a wall of the answered. And she told him that there would be no 941st name, not Oresh's, not anyone's, because the carving stopped here, not in defeat, but because the dark had ended and there was nothing left to carve. The High Keeper did as the child said. The carvers worked through the new dawn, and through the day, and through many days after, and when they were done, the great wall of the vault held the promise, and the keeping of it, and the name of the ship, and the name of the captain, and beneath all 940 names, the single word that meant answered. And the people of Oresh came, every one of them, to run their fingers along the new carving, the way Sephi had once run her fingers along the old promise, and to learn it, so that it could never be forgotten, so that their children's children would know, when they asked why there was a human name carved as tall as the ancient promise, in the holiest place on their world, exactly what it meant, and exactly what it had cost. The fleet of the humans stayed for a season above Oresh, the way the legend said, the first humans had stayed long ago. They did not need to fight anymore. There was nothing left to fight. They came down to the temple world in their small craft and walked among the keepers, and the keepers taught them the carving, pointing and drawing the way the two peoples had always talked, and the humans listened, and some of them wept too, for the captain, because Vale had been loved, Sephi understood, the way the keepers loved the names on the wall. Corin Hale came down often. He was the new captain now, of a different ship, and he sat with the child Sephi on the steps of the vault in the light of the new dawn, and through the device in her ear, he told her about Captain Idris Vale, who she had been, the young engineer with the burned hands, the long voyages, the kind of person she was. He told Sephi that the humans had listened for the fire of Oresh for 10,000 years, and that most of them, in their hearts, had stopped believing it would ever come, the way Sephi's archivist had stopped believing the humans were real. He told her that when the fire finally came, after 10,000 years, the listeners had nearly missed it, and he told her that Captain Vale had been the one who said turn the fleet. Vale had been the one who believed. Vale had crossed the gulf because a fire had been lit on a world her people had promised, 10,000 years ago, never to forget, and she had kept that promise with her own life, and there was no better way, Hale said, for a human to go. One day, near the end of the season, Sephi took the new captain into the vault and showed him the high wall, and the ancient promise, and the small human words beneath it, the only human words on the whole wall, the ones no keeper had ever been able to read. The words the young human woman had spoken 10,000 years ago, with her hand pressed flat against the stone, before any sun had gone dark, before the devouring was anything but a far-off rumor at the rim of the cluster. Sci-Fi pointed to them and asked Corin Hale, through the device in her ear, if he could read them. She had wondered her whole life what they said. She had a feeling, now, that she was ready to know. Corin Hale stood a long time in front of the old letters, and his face changed as he read, and Sci-Fi saw that the words moved him the way the names moved the keepers. He told her that the woman who carved them must have been one of the first humans ever to stand here, one of the dozen who came in the single ship before the dark, and that she had clearly understood something the rest of her crew had been too young to say. He read the words aloud, slowly, and the device gave them to Sci-Fi in the language of Oresh, and they were these. "We cannot stay. We cannot eat your enemy for you, but we have written you down, and we do not lose the things we have written down, and the dark has never yet been patient enough to wait out a people who refuse to be forgotten. Light the fire. We will be a long time coming. We will come." Sci-Fi sat down on the cold stone when she heard it. The first humans had known, 10,000 years ago, before the first sun died, a young woman from a blue world had stood in this hall and looked at the wall of names and understood exactly what would happen and exactly what her people would do, and had carved the truth into the stone where no one could read it, trusting that one day, when the fire was finally lit, someone would. They had not promised to be quick. They had promised to come. And they had, after 10,000 years, after 940 deaths, on the strength of a child's burned hands, and they had paid for it with a captain and a ship, and they had never once, in all that long time, considered not keeping the promise, because they did not lose the things they had written down. When the season ended, the fleet prepared to leave. They would carry the story home, Hale said, across the gulf, to the small blue world the keepers had thought was a legend, so that the humans too would carve it, in their own way, into their own memory. He told Sci-Fi that her name would be in it, the child who lit the fire. He told her that 10,000 years from now, human children would be told the story of the keeper of the floor on the temple world who looked up, and that some of them, the way children do, would not entirely believe it, and would be told by some tired archivist that it was only a legend, a comfort, a thing carved by frightened people long ago. And Sci-Fi, 11 turns old, with healing hands and a saved world, and a wall full of answered names, told the new captain, through the device in her ear, that this was all right. Let them think it a legend, she said. Let them stop believing. Because the keepers of Oresh had stopped believing too, for 940 deaths, right up until the night the legend came down out of the dark and proved itself true. A legend that no one believes, she said, is still true. And a true thing, when the dark finally comes for it, when someone finally lights the fire, has a way of arriving. Corin Hale looked at the child a long while after she said that. Then he nodded, the human nod, the one Vale had taught her, the one that said, "I see what it cost you, and it worked, and I will remember." And he stood, and he went back up to the fleet, and the next morning the ships of the humans rose from their stations and turned their great fronts toward the Gulf, and were gone, back across the dark toward the blue world, at the end of the legend, carrying the story of Oresh home. Sci-Fi watched them go from the steps of the vault. She did not cry this time. She had cried enough, and besides, she had a duty. When the last ship had faded into the stars, she turned and went back inside, into the great hall of the answered names, and she picked up her broom from where it leaned against the pillar, and she began, as she had every morning of her life, to sweep the 9 stone aisles. But she swept them differently now. She kept her eyes up. The High Keeper had given the order, that very first dawn, that the keepers of Oresh would no longer keep their eyes on the floor, because the floor was no longer the only thing that belonged to them. The sky belonged to them again. The keepers would look up, all of them, from now on, the way the child had looked up the night the dark came, and they would teach their children to look up, and the legend of the long memory would be told on Oresh, not as a comfort, but as a fact, the way you tell a child the suns will rise, because they had, because they did, because the dark had come for the last world, and a fire had been lit, and a fleet had arrived. Sci-Fi grew up on Oresh. She became a keeper, and then the High Keeper, the youngest in the long history of the vault, and she kept the answered names for a long good life, under 2 sons. For the humans, before they left, had done one last thing for the world they saved. They had given Oresh light. They had taken the cold, dead husks of the eaten suns, and, with engines the keepers did not understand, and did not need to, kindled them again, not as they were, but enough, 2 warm points in the sky, where there had been 2 wounds, so that the temple world would never again live in the dark. It was the last gift of a people who paid their debts. The keepers called the new suns by the only names that fit. They called the larger one Veil, and the smaller one Memory, and they rose every morning over the world that a child had saved by looking up. There was one thing more that Sci-Fi did, in the long middle years of her keeping, that the keepers of Aresh would carry forward for as long as their world endured. She built a watch, not against the devouring was dead, and she had been there to see it die. She built a watch for the dark in general, for whatever else might one day come hunting through the quiet between the stars, and she built it not out of fear, but out of debt. The humans had listened for the fire of Aresh for 10,000 years, faithfully, when no fire ever came, and that faithfulness had saved her world. So the keepers of Aresh would listen too from now on, out into the dark, for the fire of any other people the cold ever came for. And if such a fire ever burned, anywhere they could see it, Sci-Fi taught, the keepers would not say it was too far, or too dangerous, or only a legend. They would remember the night their own fire was answered, and they would go. The temple world that had once only kept the names of the dead became, in Sci-Fi's lifetime, a world that kept watch for the living, and that, she would say, was the truest carving the humans ever left on Aresh, the one cut not into stone, but into the people themselves, that a debt of light is paid forward, into the dark, to whoever needs it next. The old archivist lived long enough to see the watch begin. He came to Sci-Fi, near the end of his days, the same old man who had told her the humans were a lie, and made her cry for believing, and he did not make excuses, because he was a keeper, and keepers do not lie to themselves. He only asked her to forgive him for teaching her not to hope, and Sci-Fi, by then a keeper herself, took his thin old hands the way the captain had once taken hers, and told him there was nothing to forgive. He had not taught her not to hope, she said. He had taught her how much it cost to hope and be wrong, year after year, and that was a true thing, and a hard one, and worth knowing. He had only been wrong about one fire, and being wrong about one fire, she told him, was a small price for a world that had learned, in a single night, to look up. And on the wall of the vault of the last names, beneath the ancient promise, and the name of the ship, and the name of the captain, and the 940 answered names, there was one more carving, the last one ever cut into that stone, ordered by the High Keeper Sci-Fi, in the last year of her long life, so that no archivist of any age could ever again call the thing a comfort or a lie. It said, in letters as tall as a child, they thought we were a legend. And then their fleet arrived,